Ward walked onto the sprawling grounds of Fort with the same quiet precision that had carried her through countless covert missions. Her footsteps were deliberate, measured, unhurried, as if she owned not just the space she moved through, but the energy around her. At 42, she was fit, her lean, muscular frame honed over decades of Navy SEAL training, yet her presence was understated. She wore simple jeans and a gray jacket with a black duffel slung over her shoulder. There were no medals pinned to her chest, no military insignia to draw attention, just a civilian consultant reporting for duty. The soldiers milling around the base hardly noticed her. Some glanced her way briefly and looked away, whispering to each other with amused smirks. "The new civilian advisor," one muttered under his breath, "probably just paperwork and coffee runs." A younger private, barely out of boot camp, nudged his friend and said, "Yeah, looks like Grandma is joining us." Didn't react. She had learned long ago that ego-driven responses were a waste of energy. Instead, she observed, taking mental notes on the soldiers' movements, their posture, the way they carried themselves, and most importantly, the gaps in their discipline. Her assignment had come unexpectedly, a short-term contract to assist with tactical training and procedural oversight. After 20 years of service in some of the world's most dangerous and secretive operations, was accustomed to walking into hostile environments where no one knew her, where her reputation was meaningless. This was different, yet familiar in its challenge. Here, the enemy wasn't an opposing force overseas. It was ignorance, arrogance, and careless confidence that could cost lives in ways more subtle than bullets and bombs. As she moved through the base, she noticed the lack of basic discipline in small, telling ways. A soldier juggling his phone while walking with heavy packs, another improperly wearing his safety vest during a live-fire drill, a sergeant laughing at a rookie's mistake instead of correcting it. She filed the observations away quietly. Most civilians would have been intimidated, overwhelmed even by the sheer scale of the base and the seeming chaos of the soldiers' behavior. However, found it intriguing. It was a challenge, a puzzle waiting to be solved. Her first stop was the administrative office to collect her temporary identification badge and locker assignment. As she approached the reception desk, the clerk gave her a cursory glance before glancing down at the paperwork. "Locker 23, he said, without looking up, nodded politely, slinging her duffel higher on her shoulder. "Thank you," she replied. The directions led her through a maze of corridors lined with lockers, training posters, and motivational slogans that had long since lost their meaning for those who passed them daily. She located her locker, only to find a note taped to it. "Use men's changing area. Women's is full." A minor inconvenience, she thought, but one that would have consequences she could already sense. After 2 decades of life-threatening operations, had learned that small oversights often led to larger confrontations. She made her way to the men's changing area, her movements calm and confident. A few soldiers glanced at her as she passed, some whispering, others outright staring, trying to assess whether she was someone they needed to respect or someone they could dismiss. Could read them instantly, the smirks, the casual postures, the subtle tests of attention. None of them realized that her stillness was not weakness, but awareness. Every eye contact, every fleeting glance, every whispered comment was a piece of data. She reached her assigned locker and opened it, setting her duffel down and removing a spare shirt. That was when she felt it, the first tangible sense of underestimation she had encountered since leaving active duty. 3 soldiers at the far end of the room were watching her, leaning casually against the lockers, whispering and chuckling amongst themselves. Their gaze was not one of curiosity, but of thinly veiled contempt. "Who does she think she is?" one of them muttered. "Probably doesn't even know how to hold a weapon." Didn't respond. She let them make assumptions. She had become a master of letting people reveal themselves, a skill that had saved her countless times in combat. Still, she stored the moment in memory, a mental note of the first interaction, the first real spark of friction. She sensed the tension already rising like a storm on the horizon, small, subtle, but inevitable. For the next hour, she moved quietly through orientation. Introductions were formal and perfunctory, with most soldiers barely listening. A lieutenant made a passing joke about having an old lady in the ranks now, and a few chuckled nervously, smiled politely, letting the comment slide off her back. She had spent years in the Navy SEALs where humor often masked tension, and tension masked danger. She knew that every slight, every joke, every mocking whisper was an attempt to test her limits. And she intended to pass that test on her own terms. After orientation, she returned to the changing area to prepare for a physical assessment. This was the first time she would encounter the soldiers in a context where skill, not speculation, mattered. She changed into training gear, securing her hair and checking her equipment. Every muscle in her body was coiled with readiness, yet she projected calm. She was ready, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and strategically. Before she left the locker room, she paused and observed the three soldiers from earlier. They were whispering again, pointing subtly in her direction. One of them tossed a towel carelessly, hitting another soldier on the shoulder. Their lack of awareness grated at her, a dangerous combination of arrogance and recklessness. His mind cataloged everything: their size, their posture, the way they shifted weight, the subtle tells of impatience and immaturity. As she stepped out of the locker room, she knew that her presence would not remain unnoticed for long. The underestimation she had sensed would soon evolve into confrontation. She would not seek it, but neither would she avoid it. For someone who had spent 20 years navigating deadly combat zones, unprovoked hostility in a base locker room was almost amusing. And yet, she understood the lesson she would impart would need to be decisive, clear, and unforgettable. Ward, silent, composed, and unreadable, walked toward the training field. Soldiers were beginning to take notice, whispers following her like shadows. They had no idea who she was, and for them, that ignorance was dangerous. Didn't look back, didn't need to. In moments, the illusion of weakness would be shattered, and those who mocked her would discover a truth they would not forget for a lifetime. The morning sun glinted harshly off the metal training grounds as Ward stepped onto the field, her presence quiet but commanding. Soldiers lined up for their routine drills, some stretching lazily, others chatting with half-hearted attention. His eyes swept over them like a predator assessing its territory, every muscle tense, every movement catalogued. She had been in far deadlier situations than a military base, yet the arrogance and inexperience of these men reminded her sharply of the most dangerous adversaries she had faced: overconfident, untrained, and ignorant. Her first interaction with the soldiers was subtle. She corrected a private who was improperly adjusting his rifle during the warm-up. "Your stance will fail you in combat," she said, her voice even, almost conversational. The private laughed nervously. "We're just warming up, ma'am, don't sweat it." Gaze didn't waver. Her patience was a shield, her observation a weapon. She didn't lecture, she demonstrated. By the time she showed the proper stance and grip, the private's hands shook slightly as he replicated her movements. A group of soldiers at the far edge of the field watched her with barely disguised amusement. "Who is she anyway?" one muttered. "Civilian trainer, I guess, probably won't even last a week with us." Another scoffed. "Yeah, bet she couldn't run 10 miles without collapsing." His ears registered every word. Her mind, honed over decades of high-stakes operations, did not merely listen. It analyzed, categorized, and stored. These soldiers were testing her boundaries, seeing what they could get away with. Lunch came too quickly. Returned to the mess hall, her movements smooth, confident. Soldiers continued to whisper and stare, their mockery growing bolder. One young private deliberately dropped his tray near her foot, causing a minor clatter. "Oops, watch your step, lady," he said with a grin. Eyes flicked to him, calm, assessing the angle of the tray, the speed of his retreat, the rhythm of his breathing. He expected anger or embarrassment. She gave neither. Instead, she picked up her tray and moved to an empty table, letting him stew in his misjudged bravado. Her patience was not weakness, it was strategy. Over 20 years in the Navy SEALs, she had learned the art of waiting, of letting ego lead opponents into traps of their own making. Every soldier who mocked her, underestimated her, or laughed at her age and gender was catalogued. Their weaknesses, their arrogance, their impatience, all would be revealed in time. And when they were, she would act with precision, minimal effort, and absolute control. But the underestimation was growing faster than she liked. By the afternoon, whispers and jokes had become overt comments. While supervising basic drills, a group of soldiers openly questioned her instructions. "You sure you know what you're doing?" one asked loudly. "Yeah, maybe we should call someone who's actually seen combat," another added, smirking. Felt the familiar tightening of her jaw, a subtle warning, a signal she would not tolerate disrespect, but still she did not react outwardly. Instead, she allowed the moment to become a teaching opportunity. She stopped the drill, called everyone to attention, and demonstrated the exact maneuver they had been attempting incorrectly. Each step was precise, fluid, efficient, and undeniably superior. The soldiers watched, their smirks fading as reality sank in. His movements were not flashy, they were lethal in practicality, honed over countless missions where mistakes were punished with death. By the end, the soldiers were breathing heavily, their muscles aching from doing the exercise correctly for the first time. Even so, whispers followed her like shadows. "She's good, but there's no way she's ever been in real combat," muttered one soldier under his breath. Heard it, of course. She didn't need to respond. Words meant little, actions meant everything. She allowed them to hold their misconceptions. They would be more effective lessons later. The day wore on, made rounds, observing, instructing, and subtly correcting every misstep. Every soldier who had mocked her before now found themselves following her movements, imitating her precision without realizing it. And yet the undercurrent of tension was palpable. Some soldiers weren't just skeptical, they were openly hostile. Their ignorance and pride had begun to ferment into something more dangerous. Could feel it, the way you feel a storm before it breaks. Back in the locker room, the scene was even more telling. Had retrieved her duffel to adjust her gear, only to notice three soldiers whispering, their eyes flicking toward her in a combination of amusement and challenge. The same men who had disrupted her drills in subtle ways now looked emboldened. One of them, tall and broad, nudged the smaller one and muttered, "Think she can handle herself if we push her?" Their voices were low, but clear enough to be heard. His eyes followed them coolly, reading the tension in their postures. Their arrogance was about to collide with reality. The three were confident, dismissive, and reckless, the perfect storm of overconfidence. They didn't know that had spent decades in far deadlier environments, facing adversaries who thrived on fear and chaos. They didn't know she had trained countless operatives in survival, tactical combat, and mental resilience. And most importantly, they didn't know that underestimating her would be their biggest mistake. Didn't confront them immediately. Instead, she focused on her own preparation, methodically changing into her training gear, adjusting straps and securing her equipment. Her calmness was deliberate, a tool to unsettle, to make her presence known without the need for confrontation. She understood the psychology of intimidation as well as she understood combat. Calm, composed, and deliberate presence could dismantle ego faster than any physical strike. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, the tension reached an almost tangible peak. Moved toward the exit of the locker room, knowing that sooner or later someone would test her. She felt it in their glances, in the subtle shifts of weight, in the nervous excitement that precedes misjudged aggression. It wasn't fear. They were too ignorant for that. It was the thrill of a challenge they assumed they could dominate. And she would allow it, for the lesson to be learned in its form. By the end of the day, had observed every flaw in their discipline, cataloged every arrogance-driven misstep, and predicted where the first confrontation would occur. Her experience had taught her that the smallest openings in ego could lead to explosive outcomes. She had patience, precision, and the knowledge to control the storm when it arrived. All that remained was to wait, quietly, methodically, with the calm of someone who had faced far worse than this. As she exited the base for the evening, allowed herself a subtle smile. These soldiers thought they were in control of the environment. They thought they could mock, test, and belittle without consequence. Tomorrow, everything would change. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with precision, authority, and undeniable skill. They were about to discover that the woman they had underestimated was not only capable but unstoppable. And in her mind she silently noted, The storm was coming, and they wouldn't see it until it had passed. The next morning, the base was alive with activity, soldiers moving quickly between drills, their voices echoing across the training grounds. Arrived at the locker room early, her pace calm, measured yet purposeful. She had noticed the three soldiers from yesterday, the tall, brash one, the sneaky whisperer, and the smallest, cocky private, casting glances her way. She knew, without doubt, that sooner or later their arrogance would manifest into direct confrontation. Her instincts were telling her this was the moment, yet she moved as if unaware, her demeanor serene, almost casual. She opened her assigned locker to retrieve a spare uniform and her duffel bag. The room smelled faintly of sweat, detergent, and the metallic tang of military life. She moved with quiet efficiency, methodically folding gear and checking straps. That was when she felt the first shift in the air, a subtle tightening, the tiny ripple of unease that only seasoned operatives notice. The three soldiers had positioned themselves near the door, leaning casually against lockers but staring intently. They were testing boundaries, probing for weakness, and unaware that the predator they were poking had survived situations far worse than anything they could imagine. "Hey," the tall one called out, loud enough to echo off the metal walls. "You lost, lady. This isn't the women's locker room." His grin was forced, masking a slight hesitation which noticed immediately. He thought he was intimidating her with humor, but she only tilted her head slightly, unbothered. "I'm where I need to be," said evenly, her voice calm, smooth, devoid of emotion. She didn't smile, didn't apologize. Her tone carried authority, a quiet weight that made even the bravest soldier pause. The sneaky whisperer snorted. "You're useless, you know that?" His words carried the arrogance of ignorance, the type of bravado born from never having faced real danger. He took a small step closer, his fingers brushing against the strap of his duffel bag. The tall one laughed and nudged him forward. The smallest soldier, boldest of the three, stepped in front of her, a smirk on his face. "Yeah, let's see if she can even handle herself. Move over, lady." He reached out and grabbed her collar, attempting to shove her aside. "You're nothing here." For a moment remained still. Her body relaxed, her eyes narrowing subtly as she assessed their angles, their strength, the rhythm of their movements. She didn't panic, she didn't flinch. 20 years of high-risk operations had taught her that control came from patience and awareness. One misstep, one flicker of emotion, and the situation could spiral. She allowed them to believe they had the advantage, let them commit to their own mistake. The tallest one, seeing his companion making contact, reached out and wrapped an arm around her neck, attempting a crude chokehold. "Let's see what you've got," he sneered. They laughed, assuming dominance, unaware that they had just triggered the awakening of someone they could not overpower. His mind was a machine of calculation. Muscle memory from decades of SEAL training guided her as she shifted her weight slightly, slipping the chokehold with minimal effort. Her movements were fluid, precise, and controlled. The smallest soldier stumbled forward off balance as his elbow delivered a sharp, measured impact to his midsection, forcing him to double over. The tall one tensed, pulling back slightly, seized the opportunity, executing a smooth, defensive maneuver she had drilled hundreds of times. She used his momentum against him, pivoting and guiding him toward the lockers. His hands flailed, grasping at air, but he could not regain control. With a practiced sweep, she swept his legs out, sending him sprawling onto the floor. The sneaky whisperer attempted to strike her from the side, but she anticipated the move, stepping in and applying a controlled wrist lock that forced him to the ground, his arm painfully bent behind him. Pain flashed across his face, but its hold was precise, not cruel, just effective. All three soldiers were now on the floor, gasping, wide-eyed, their bravado shattered in a matter of seconds. Straightened, breathing evenly, her stance calm and unthreatening. Her voice cut through the room, firm, low, and undeniable. "If you ever put hands on someone again without discipline or respect, I will not hesitate. And this," she gestured to their sprawled forms, "is the lesson you will remember." The other soldiers in the room had frozen at the spectacle, some whispering, some staring in disbelief. She just, one muttered, voice trembling. No one moved. No one had anticipated the skill, speed, or calm authority possessed. The illusion of a harmless civilian had been obliterated in 10 seconds. The three men on the floor scrambled backward, trying to regain composure, their faces pale. They had assumed they were in control, that they could bully someone who looked vulnerable. Instead, they faced someone whose experience made their attacks trivial. They realized with a shock that coursed through their egos like ice that they had confronted a master of combat, someone who had survived far deadlier situations than a locker room confrontation. His gaze swept the room, taking in the reactions of the other soldiers. Some eyes were wide with fear, others with awe, and a few with begrudging respect. She made no move toward further aggression. She had made her point. Her actions were decisive, controlled, and unambiguous. She had demonstrated that disrespect, arrogance, and underestimation came at a price. "You may think strength comes from size or noise," continued, her voice calm but authoritative, "but it comes from discipline, awareness, and control. Remember this. Remember what happens when you let ego override judgment." She stepped back, adjusting her duffel and preparing to leave. She had taught her lesson without excessive force, leaving them with the clear understanding that they were not dealing with a civilian. They were facing someone far beyond their assumptions. The three soldiers scrambled to their feet, faces red with embarrassment and anger, but they said nothing. Their mockery had been silenced, their assumptions destroyed. The room remained quiet, tense, charged with the electricity of realized mistakes. Left the locker room, her calm composure unshaken, as whispers filled the space behind her. Some whispered her name, others speculated about who she was. No one doubted her skill. Later, when the base commander arrived to investigate the commotion, provided her identification and credentials. The commander's eyes widened as he read through the records. Navy SEAL operative, 20 years of service, multiple overseas deployments, Silver Star recipient, expert in close-quarters combat. The entire room fell silent as the weight of her experience became clear. Those who had mocked her now realized they had been in the presence of someone who had survived far deadlier scenarios than they could imagine. The locker room confrontation became the defining moment of the day. Soldiers who had doubted her before now treated her with respect, not out of fear alone, but out of recognition for her unmatched skill and authority. The three men who had attacked her were disciplined, but calm handling of the situation left them shaken, reflective, and silently thankful that their humiliation had not escalated into real harm. By the time exited the base later that afternoon, she had already begun to reshape the hierarchy and culture of respect. Word spread quickly. The civilian advisor was anything but ordinary. Soldiers shared their accounts in hushed tones, recounting the precision, speed, and composure of the woman who had neutralized three men without unnecessary violence. The locker room incident would not be forgotten. It had set a precedent, a warning, and a lesson, all rolled into a single, unforgettable moment. His mind, ever analytical, cataloged the day's events. The arrogance and ignorance of the three soldiers had revealed their limits, their insecurities, and their potential. They had assumed she was weak. She had proven them wrong. But this was just the beginning. In the coming days, she would use her experience to instill discipline, teamwork, and tactical awareness in the entire base. This confrontation was only the first ripple of change, one that would grow into a tidal wave. As she walked across the field, gear secured, posture perfect, and eyes sharp, allowed herself a subtle private smile. They had learned a lesson they would never forget. Never underestimate someone based on appearance, age, or assumptions. Respect was earned and it was non-negotiable. And Ward, silent, lethal, and disciplined, had just made that abundantly clear. The soldiers had tested her. They had failed. And the real lessons were only beginning. The aftermath of the locker room confrontation rippled through fort like an electric current. Soldiers whispered in corners, recounting what they had seen. 3 men brought to the ground in seconds, their pride shattered, and a civilian standing calmly, almost effortlessly, in the midst of the chaos. Ward walked through the base that morning with the same calm she had always possessed, but now there was an unmistakable awareness in the eyes of those around her. The whispers were there, yes, but they carried a different tone, a mixture of awe, curiosity, and a reluctant respect. Her first stop was the training grounds. The soldiers were still assembling, this time more disciplined, more attentive. They glanced at her warily, unsure if today's drills would challenge them or expose further weaknesses. Didn't address them immediately. She let them feel the tension, the uncertainty. In moments like these, the mind can be as vulnerable as the body, and she knew how to exploit it with subtlety and authority. "Attention," she called, her voice clear, firm, and commanding. Heads snapped toward her. Every soldier could sense the weight behind her words, even if they didn't yet understand it. She began with the drills, but not the usual physical routines. Today was about awareness, about precision, about the discipline that could prevent a misstep from turning deadly. She demonstrated a series of movements, stances, grips, and tactical steps, each executed with flawless efficiency, smooth as water over rocks. The soldiers tried to imitate her. Some faltered. Some laughed nervously, attempting to mask their own insecurity. Eyes swept across the group, noting every misalignment, every lapse in focus, every hesitation. She corrected gently but decisively, demonstrating once again that control and discipline were far more important than brute strength. Muscle alone was nothing without the mind guiding it. By the end of the drill, even the strongest, most arrogant soldiers were panting, exhausted, and humbled, not by physical strain alone, but by the realization of the precision and skill required to execute the movements correctly. Word had already spread among the base that something extraordinary had occurred in the locker room the day before. Even those who had not witnessed it directly were intrigued, anxious to see if the rumors were true. A few soldiers tried to act indifferent, but's presence made it impossible to hide fear or curiosity. The illusion of her being a mere civilian consultant had evaporated. She was, quite evidently, far more than anyone had assumed. By midday, the three men who had attacked her avoided her gaze. Their pride had been thoroughly tested, their assumptions shattered, made no effort to single them out, and yet their humiliation was a constant presence. They were living reminders to the rest of the base that disrespect had consequences. Some whispered to each other that the woman had moved faster than they thought possible, neutralizing three fully grown men with precision and minimal effort. The more they tried to rationalize it, the deeper their shock became. Even the base commander, who had initially underestimated her, now observed with a mixture of respect and astonishment. He had read her file, the credentials, the missions, the decorations, but seeing her in action changed everything. This was not a consultant who could offer advice on paper. This was someone who could train soldiers to survive, to excel, and to dominate their environment. His confidence in her authority grew with every passing minute. His approach to leadership was unconventional yet effective. She never shouted, never humiliated unnecessarily. Her corrections were precise, her movements fluid, and her presence commanding. The soldiers learned quickly that any attempt to undermine her would be met with swift, effective response. Her lessons were not about intimidation. They were about mastery, discipline, and awareness. In these early days, she was laying the foundation for something greater than respect, a transformation in mindset. As the afternoon drills progressed, introduced tactical exercises designed to challenge both body and mind. Soldiers were tasked with navigation, decision-making under pressure, and controlled combat scenarios. Those who had doubted her began to struggle. They realized that what had seemed simple, the precision movements, the stances, the attention to detail, was anything but. Each misstep was corrected with calm authority, reinforcing the lesson that discipline and focus were non-negotiable. The three men who had confronted her in the locker room were present for every drill, their expressions a mix of resentment and reluctant admiration. Observed them carefully, understanding that punishment alone was insufficient. They needed to see the value of skill, discipline, and humility to internalize the lesson fully. She guided them with subtle adjustments, forcing them to recognize their own limitations without public humiliation, making the lesson far more potent. By late afternoon, the base was buzzing with stories of the locker room incident. Soldiers gathered in small groups, exchanging accounts with wide eyes and hushed tones. Even those who were skeptical of her skills began to whisper about her reputation, wondering what else she could teach them. The tension in the air was palpable. The soldiers were eager to prove themselves under her scrutiny but wary of making mistakes. During a short break, walked among them quietly, observing. She did not speak unless necessary. Her gaze alone communicated authority, focus, and expectation. Soldiers straightened, adjusted gear, and moved with greater attention. Her presence had become a silent instructor, reinforcing discipline simply by existing within the space. One of the soldiers, younger and overconfident, attempted to challenge her authority indirectly, questioning a maneuver during a drill. Paused, her expression unreadable. "Explain your reasoning," she said evenly. The soldier faltered, unable to articulate a coherent response. She repeated the maneuver, demonstrating not just the physical technique but the reasoning behind each movement. By the time she finished, the soldier's expression had shifted from defiance to comprehension. The lesson was clear. Knowledge and skill were inseparable, and arrogance without understanding was dangerous. As the day drew to a close, gathered the soldiers for a final briefing. She addressed the group calmly but firmly. "Today you learned that assumptions are dangerous. You learned that respect is earned through skill, discipline, and awareness. Anyone who underestimates another for whatever reason risks failure, sometimes serious failure." Her words were measured, each one carrying weight. The soldiers listened intently, the reality of the previous day and today's lessons settling in. The transformation was already. The arrogance and casual disregard for protocol had begun to diminish. Soldiers moved with greater awareness, corrected each other's mistakes, and began to emulate the discipline demonstrated. Even the 3 men from the locker room incident were taking tentative steps toward humility, though it was clear the lesson would take time to fully internalize. As she left the training grounds, allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. The initial confrontation had been necessary, not to humiliate but to establish boundaries, to correct misconceptions, and to assert authority without unnecessary violence. What had followed was just the beginning of reshaping the culture of the base. Discipline, respect, and mastery were not given, they were earned, and she would see that lesson carried through, fully and unequivocally. For Ward, this was a familiar pattern: assess, act decisively, and let results speak. The soldiers had learned in just 10 seconds the day before that misjudgment could be costly. Today, they were learning the deeper lesson. True skill required patience, focus, and humility. And she would ensure that this lesson, reinforced day after day, became ingrained in every soldier who walked the grounds of Fort. The day ended with observing quietly from the sidelines as the soldiers wrapped up their drills. Their movements were sharper, their attention more focused, and the whispers of doubt that had followed her yesterday were replaced by quiet respect. They did not yet fully understand the depth of her experience, the breadth of her skill, or the countless situations where calm control had meant survival. But they were beginning to see that the woman they had underestimated was far more than any of them had imagined. Tomorrow, the lessons would continue, and the soldiers, whether ready or not, would be tested again, both physically and mentally. Ward's presence had already begun to shift the culture of the base, and the ripple effects would be felt long after the drills concluded. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the base had changed subtly but irreversibly. Soldiers moved differently, spoke differently, and most importantly, thought differently. Had set a new standard, one that could not be ignored, underestimated, or dismissed. She had arrived as a quiet presence, a seemingly ordinary civilian. Yet by the end of the day, she had become something far more significant, a force of discipline, skill, and authority that demanded recognition. And in the quiet moments after everyone had left, reflected briefly on the coming days. The true test was yet to come, not in drills or whispers, but in how these soldiers would integrate discipline, focus, and respect into every action. Her work had only begun, and she was ready to ensure that the lessons she had begun instilling would leave an indelible mark on Fort and on every soldier who had dared to underestimate her. The next morning, Fort buzzed with anticipation, though no one knew exactly why. Rumors had spread quickly about the civilian advisor who had neutralized 3 fully grown soldiers in the locker room the day before. Some spoke in hushed tones, wondering if the stories were exaggerated. Others speculated about her background, filling in gaps with wild imagination. Ward arrived calmly, her duffel over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. She had already anticipated the attention, the whispers, and the skepticism. Today she would provide clarity, but not through force. Today she would let truth speak for itself. Her first stop was the base commander's office. He had called her in for a meeting, his expression a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and subtle awe. The commander, a seasoned military officer, had been impressed by the precision of her actions during the drills but had no idea of her full background. Handed him a sealed folder, her eyes calm, steady, commanding attention. He opened it carefully. The room fell silent as he read the documents. Navy SEAL operative, 20 years of service, multiple overseas deployments, Silver Star recipient, master instructor in close quarters combat. Every line of the report carried weight. Every mission listed represented years of experience and danger that few could comprehend. The commander's eyes widened, his usual composure faltering for a moment. She's a SEAL, he murmured, almost to himself. His voice carried disbelief, and the weight of realization settled in the room. Nodded subtly. She had not revealed her credentials until this moment. The soldiers who had doubted her, mocked her, and even attacked her were about to understand the full extent of the woman standing before them. Word spread quickly through the base. Soldiers gathered in small groups, straining to catch any glimpse of. The 3 men from the locker room confrontation were present, their expressions a mix of shock, disbelief, and the first glimmers of respect. They had assumed that their initial challenge had been merely a test of patience, not the awakening of a veteran SEAL. His presence was calm, but the impact of her revelation was immediate. Soldiers whispered her name, speculated about missions, and debated the plausibility of her feats. Every story about her precision, speed, and composure during drills suddenly took on new weight. She was no ordinary trainer. She was someone who had survived situations where mistakes meant death, someone who had mastered the very skills these soldiers were only beginning to understand. The commander, regaining his composure, addressed the gathered soldiers. "Ward will now lead all advanced tactical training at Fort," he announced, his voice firm and authoritative. "She has the experience, the skill, and the discipline to prepare each of you for the challenges you will face, not just here but wherever duty calls." The room fell silent. Soldiers shifted nervously, absorbing the weight of the announcement. Some swallowed hard, realizing that their earlier arrogance had been dangerously misplaced. Others stared at with wide eyes, all mingled with nervous anticipation. The 3 men who had confronted her in the locker room avoided her gaze, understanding now that they had directly challenged someone far beyond their comprehension. Did not smile, did not boast, and did not scold. Her authority spoke for itself. She began organizing the day's drills, each movement precise, deliberate, and purposeful. Soldiers followed her instructions carefully, aware that any mistake, however small, could reveal the depth of her expertise and their own limitations. She emphasized observation, decision-making, and control, skills that had kept her alive during 2 decades of high-risk operations. During a demonstration, showcased techniques in close-quarters combat. Every movement was fluid, efficient, and purposeful. Soldiers who had doubted her skill before watched in stunned silence as she executed maneuvers that seemed almost effortless. Every strike, block, and counterattack was calculated, demonstrating not just physical prowess but an intimate understanding of human anatomy, leverage, and timing. By the end of the demonstration, even the most skeptical soldiers had no doubt. She was extraordinary. The three soldiers from the locker room incident were next, approached them calmly, her eyes meeting each of theirs. "You were reckless yesterday," she said softly but firmly. "You assumed weakness where there was none. Today you will learn discipline, control, and respect. Follow my instructions precisely. Pay attention, learn, and do not speak unless spoken to." The men nodded, swallowing their pride. They had been humbled, and the realization of authority settled heavily upon them. What had begun as confrontation had become a profound lesson in humility and skill. Her approach was deliberate. She sought not vengeance, but transformation. The men would either rise to her standard or falter. By midday, the rest of the soldiers had joined in advanced drills, each carefully monitored by. She corrected posture, grip, and footwork with precision, demonstrating the importance of even the smallest details. Soldiers found themselves working harder than ever before, aware that their training was being guided by someone who had survived the harshest conditions imaginable. Mistakes were corrected immediately, but always with clear reasoning, never humiliation, always education. The shift in morale was noticeable. Where yesterday there had been arrogance and casual dismissal, today there was focus, curiosity, and growing respect. Soldiers who had ignored her advice before now listened attentively, eager to learn from someone who had proven herself beyond doubt. The base, once dominated by ego and casual disregard, was slowly transforming under her guidance. As the day progressed, took time to meet with small groups individually. She assessed their strengths and weaknesses, tailoring her advice to maximize improvement. Some soldiers struggled to keep pace, while others excelled. Attention was meticulous but never cruel. Her reputation spread not through intimidation but through results, measurable improvement, precision, and mastery. By late afternoon, even those who had doubted her most were speaking of her with reverence. The locker room incident, once a source of embarrassment for the three men, was now a lesson repeatedly cited as proof of her skill and authority. Soldiers began to emulate her discipline in their own routines, understanding that respect was earned through effort, attention, and results, not by loud voices or reckless behavior. The day concluded with a brief debriefing. Addressed the entire base, her voice steady and calm, commanding attention without needing to raise it. Respect is not optional. Discipline is not optional. Skill is earned through attention to detail and commitment to improvement. If you internalize these lessons, you will not only become better soldiers, you will survive where others fail. Soldiers left the field quietly, their minds racing with what they had witnessed. The aura of authority projected had already begun reshaping the culture of the base. Whispers of admiration replaced jokes of disbelief. Even those who had doubted her now regarded her as a figure of formidable experience, skill, and discipline. The three men from the locker room followed behind her, silent and thoughtful. The day had transformed their perception of her and of themselves. Pride had been replaced by humility, arrogance by attention, ignorance by curiosity. They had challenged someone they assumed to be weak and had been decisively proven wrong. The lesson was indelible, and they knew it. As walked back to her quarters at the end of the day, she allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction. The revelation of her credentials had achieved more than she could have hoped. Soldiers who had mocked, doubted, and underestimated her were now attentive, respectful, and eager to learn. The base had begun its transformation, not through intimidation, but through undeniable skill and authority. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new drills, and further tests of discipline. Ward, Navy SEAL and master of precision, would guide them every step of the way. By the time she left fort, the soldiers would carry her lessons with them, lessons in respect, discipline, and the understanding that underestimating her had been their gravest mistake. The shock of her reveal had changed everything. She was no longer just a civilian consultant. She was the standard against which all soldiers would measure themselves. The locker room incident was no longer just an event. It was the turning point, a catalyst for transformation. Ward had arrived, and Fort would never be the same. The following morning, Fort awoke under a quiet but palpable tension. Soldiers moved differently now, straightened backs, alert eyes, cautious steps. The locker room incident and Ward's revelation had left their mark. No one spoke loudly, no one swaggered through the hallways, and no one dismissed her presence. Yet curiosity and anticipation filled the air. Today was not about confrontation. It was about growth, about transforming raw soldiers into disciplined warriors. Arrived early, her movements calm and deliberate. She surveyed the training field with meticulous eyes, observing formations, noting minor inefficiencies, and cataloging subtle mistakes that could become disastrous under pressure. She didn't speak immediately. Her presence alone communicated authority. Soldiers felt it, the unspoken weight of experience, the quiet assurance that she could handle anything they might attempt, physically or mentally. The day began with tactical drills designed to develop situational awareness. Soldiers were tasked with navigating obstacles, anticipating threats, and coordinating as a team under time constraints. Watched silently, noting strengths and weaknesses. When a soldier or ignored a teammate, she intervened immediately, not with anger but with precision corrections. Adjust your stance. Maintain eye contact with your target. Anticipate before you act, she instructed calmly, her words sharp, unyielding, and instructive. As the exercises intensified, introduced unpredictability. Simulated ambushes, sudden changes in terrain, and rapid-fire scenarios tested not only physical agility but mental acuity. Soldiers who had previously relied on brute strength began to realize that intellect, awareness, and composure were just as vital. Guided them step by step, demonstrating how control and patience could outperform force. In small groups, she drilled soldiers on tactical decision-making, emphasizing communication and observation. Every environment has indicators. Every opponent has weaknesses, she said, her voice steady, yet commanding attention. If you ignore these, you jeopardize yourself and your team. Master awareness before attempting action. Soldiers listened intently, internalizing each lesson, some with awe, others with quiet disbelief. Meanwhile, the three men from the locker room incident were under particular scrutiny. Did not single them out publicly, but she watched them closely, guiding their movements subtly, correcting errors and reinforcing the importance of humility. They were now cautious, their earlier arrogance replaced with focused determination. Mistakes were no longer dismissed as trivial. They carried lessons, and these men had learned to respect the weight of her skill. By mid-morning, word of drills had spread across the base. Other soldiers, curious and slightly intimidated, watched from the sidelines. Whispers circulated. She moves like she's seen real combat. Her precision, it's unbelievable. No one here can match her skill. Even those who had doubted her before now approached with quiet attention, eager to learn, wary of testing her patience. Her approach to leadership was unconventional but effective. She rarely raised her voice. She rarely punished unnecessarily. Her methods relied on demonstration, correction, and personal accountability. Soldiers were compelled to improve not through fear, but through respect and the realization that their mistakes could be costly. By late morning, the atmosphere on the field had shifted entirely. Where chaos and arrogance once ruled, discipline and focus now prevailed. During a tactical simulation, introduced a scenario involving multiple adversaries and limited visibility. Soldiers had to navigate the terrain, communicate silently, and neutralize threats efficiently. Moved among them, offering subtle adjustments, a tip here, a correction there, but never intervening directly unless absolutely necessary. The result was remarkable. Soldiers began to anticipate each other's movements, covering blind spots, adjusting positions, and coordinating seamlessly. What had once seemed impossible to them became achievable under her guidance. The three men from the locker room had become unlikely exemplars. The tall one, previously brash and overconfident, moved with measured caution, correcting his teammates subtly. The sneaky whisperer demonstrated improved communication, anticipating movements rather than reacting impulsively. The smallest, cocky private now followed instructions diligently, aware that deviation could compromise the entire exercise. Observed their progress quietly, satisfied with the transformation. By mid-afternoon, conducted individual assessments. Each soldier was evaluated on agility, accuracy, situational awareness, and mental composure. Mistakes were corrected immediately, with providing clear reasoning behind each adjustment. Soldiers began to internalize the importance of discipline and observation, recognizing that even minor errors could escalate into critical failures in real-world scenarios. The base commander, observing from a distance, noted the rapid transformation. Soldiers who had been complacent, indifferent, or arrogant were now engaged, alert, and cooperative. Its impact extended beyond physical drills. She was reshaping attitudes, instilling a culture of accountability and respect. The lessons were not just about combat. They were about mindset, resilience, and the ability to adapt under pressure. By late afternoon, shifted to leadership drills, placing soldiers in decision-making positions and observing their ability to manage simulated crises. Her guidance emphasized foresight, communication, and calm under pressure. Soldiers who had once relied solely on force were now evaluating threats, coordinating actions, and responding with precision. Even the base's most skeptical soldiers could not deny the effectiveness of her methods. As the day drew to a close, the soldiers gathered for a debriefing, addressed the group with measured authority. Today, you learned that control, awareness, and discipline are the foundations of skill. Without these, strength is meaningless. Every action has consequences. Learn from each mistake, anticipate challenges, and trust in your preparation. Her words were calm, yet carried undeniable weight. The soldiers left the field with a renewed sense of purpose. The whispers about her skill had transformed into admiration. The locker room incident, once a source of embarrassment for a few, had become a cornerstone of respect. His methods had begun to reshape the culture of Fort. Soldiers moved with intention, spoke with precision, and carried themselves with an awareness that had previously been absent. The three men from the locker room incident walked behind her silently, their pride tempered by humility. The tall one adjusted his posture, aware of the importance of attention to detail. The sneaky whisperer communicated with subtle nods, anticipating movements. The smallest, cocky private moved cautiously, fully aware that his actions had consequences. They had been transformed not just in skill, but in mindset. Observing the results allowed herself a rare, subtle smile. The day had achieved exactly what she intended. Respect had been earned, discipline had been instilled, and the base was beginning to embrace a culture of accountability. The foundation had been laid for continued growth, and the ripple effects would extend far beyond today. As she returned to her quarters, reflected on the progress. Transformation was never immediate. It required patience, persistence, and unwavering standards. Yet today had proven that even a group of undisciplined, arrogant soldiers could adapt under the right guidance. Fort had begun to change, and Ward, silent, disciplined, and formidable, was at the center of that transformation. The base would never be the same. Soldiers who had doubted, challenged, or ignored her were now compelled to recognize her authority. Her presence had shifted the culture, elevated expectations, and instilled a lasting sense of accountability. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to reinforce the standards she demanded. Ward had arrived not just as a trainer but as a catalyst for change. And the soldiers, whether ready or not, would follow her lead or be left behind. By the seventh day at Fort, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The soldiers who had arrived with casual arrogance, whispered disrespect, and skepticism now moved with precision, alertness, and focus. Ward had transformed the base culture, not with intimidation but through skill, discipline, and consistent, unwavering authority. The locker room incident and her shocking reveal had set the foundation, and the subsequent days of rigorous drills and tactical training had cemented it. Observed quietly from the sidelines as soldiers conducted a complex navigation exercise. Teams were tasked with coordinating movements through unfamiliar terrain, simulating hostile engagement, and responding to sudden ambushes. Where only a week ago confusion, hesitation and miscommunication had dominated. Now fluidity, cooperation, and decisiveness reigned. Soldiers anticipated each other's movements, maintained situational awareness, and executed commands with precision. Noted every detail, cataloging strengths and minor weaknesses to refine in the coming drills. The three men from the locker room, now far more disciplined and aware, led small groups of recruits under guidance. The tall one moved with measured authority, demonstrating exercises he had once arrogantly mocked. The sneaky whisperer coordinated silent communications, anticipating threats and guiding teammates. The smallest, previously cocky private now exhibited patience and careful observation, correcting his peers with subtle authority. They had internalized the lessons had instilled, a testament to her effectiveness in shaping character as well as skill. Yet even as the soldiers excelled under controlled conditions, knew that true skill was measured under stress and uncertainty. Training in predictable scenarios could create confidence, but it was insufficient preparation for real crises. That afternoon, she prepared for a more demanding test, a simulated emergency designed to challenge not just physical ability, but mental resilience, teamwork, and leadership under pressure. "Listen carefully," addressed the assembled soldiers, her voice calm but commanding. "This exercise will test your ability to respond to rapidly changing threats. You will be presented with incomplete information, unexpected obstacles, and limited resources. Decisions must be made quickly, precisely, and as a unit. Mistakes will carry consequences." The soldiers, already aware of her capabilities, nodded solemnly. They understood the gravity of her words and the seriousness of the task ahead. The scenario began: a simulated breach in a remote training sector, with multiple hostiles moving unpredictably. Soldiers were required to secure the perimeter, identify threats, and coordinate extraction procedures under time constraints. Observed from a central vantage point, her experience allowing her to anticipate outcomes even before they unfolded. Minor errors were immediately corrected, subtle guidance provided, and critical decisions were tested under the simulated chaos. At first, hesitation rippled through the teams. Even the best prepared soldiers paused as simulated threats emerged from unexpected angles. But under silent observation and subtle interventions, they adjusted rapidly. Communication improved dramatically, movements synchronized, and individual strengths were harnessed effectively. Soldiers who had once floundered now thrived under pressure, executing complex maneuvers with precision and confidence. The three men who had confronted her in the locker room faced their own personal challenges during the simulation. The tall one was assigned to lead a strategic point, the sneaky whisperer managed communications, and the smallest private coordinated the movement of his squad through unpredictable terrain. Each was tested individually and as part of a team, and each responded with skill and composure they had not previously demonstrated. Noted their progress quietly, satisfied with how far they had come. As the exercise escalated, the soldiers were presented with a critical scenario, a simulated hostage situation requiring rapid decision-making, stealth, and precision strikes. Moved among the teams, providing guidance where necessary, her presence a constant stabilizing force. Soldiers executed silent signals, coordinated movements, and neutralized threats with minimal error. Their earlier arrogance and casual disregard had been replaced with disciplined teamwork and focused execution. At a critical moment, one soldier made a misstep, nearly jeopardizing the operation. Intervened not with force but with precise instruction. "Adjust your angle, maintain cover, anticipate your teammates' movement." The soldier corrected immediately, averting disaster. The lesson was clear. Even under extreme pressure, calm, precise observation, and rapid adaptation were paramount. By the end of the simulation, the entire unit had performed at peak levels, exceeding expectations. Soldiers who had doubted their own capabilities now displayed confidence rooted in skill, discipline, and experience. Methods had transformed raw recruits into capable, focused, and highly responsive operatives. The once disruptive base had evolved into a cohesive, disciplined force, prepared for challenges far beyond ordinary training exercises. The three men from the locker room approached afterward, a mixture of gratitude and humility in their expressions. "Ma'am," the tall one said quietly, "we underestimated you. We thought we knew what strength was. You've shown us a different level." The sneaky whisperer nodded, adding, "It's not just physical skill. It's everything. Awareness, control, discipline. We never understood until now." Even the smallest, cocky private, usually quick to joke or boast, remained silent, eyes wide with recognition of the depth of her ability and leadership. Regarded them calmly, her eyes steady. Strength without control is meaningless. Discipline without awareness is useless. Today, you've demonstrated both. Remember this lesson. Carry it into everything you do, not just here, but anywhere you may be tested. Her words were measured, firm, and resonant. They were not mere praise, they were a benchmark, a standard, and a challenge to uphold. Word of the simulation's success spread quickly across Fort. Other soldiers, previously skeptical, now sought guidance, observing methods, and seeking to emulate her precision. The base culture had shifted completely. Respect had replaced arrogance, discipline had replaced casual disregard, and curiosity had replaced indifference. His presence had fundamentally changed not only the soldiers but the environment itself. Even the base commander acknowledged the transformation. He approached quietly after the drills concluded. "I've seen many trainers over the years," he said, voice low and serious, "but none with your experience, authority, and impact. You've done more in a week than most achieve in a year. The base, the soldiers, they're different because of you." Simply nodded, her expression calm. The work was never about accolades, it was about results, about shaping people to meet the demands of reality. As the sun began to set over Fort, reflected on the week's progress. The soldiers had grown remarkably, not just in skill but in mindset. Ego and arrogance had been replaced with respect and focus. Mistakes were now lessons rather than opportunities for mockery. And the three men who had once challenged her were now living examples of transformation. Disciplined, focused, and aware of the true meaning of skill and leadership. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but was confident. The foundation had been laid, the lessons instilled, and the culture reshaped. The ultimate test was never about intimidation. It was about transformation, about guiding people to see their own potential, and about ensuring they understood that skill, discipline, and awareness were inseparable. Ward had done more than prove herself. She had reshaped an entire base, turning raw recruits into disciplined, capable soldiers. And though the challenges ahead would continue, Fort would never be the same. The lessons had been learned, the standard had been set, and the influence of a 20-year SEAL operative had created a force that could withstand chaos, uncertainty, and any challenge thrown its way. The soldiers, now more than mere trainees, had begun to embody the lessons of precision, discipline, and controlled strength. They had been tested, humbled, and transformed, and Ward, calm, deliberate, and unstoppable, had guided them every step of the way. The final day of Ward's intensive training cycle dawned with a crisp, cool air over Fort. Soldiers rose earlier than usual, a quiet energy of anticipation and determination in every movement. His reputation had spread like wildfire across the base, and now every eye was on her, not in fear, but in focus, respect, and admiration. What had begun as skepticism, arrogance, and whispering disdain had transformed into discipline, coordination, and quiet pride. The base commander, himself seasoned and observant, watched from his office window, impressed with the remarkable shift in the troops. Where once chaos, inattention, and arrogance had dominated, now cohesion, precision, and anticipation guided every action. Influence was no longer just visible in the drills, it was embedded in the soldiers' mindset. They moved as a unit, thought as a unit, and anticipated as a unit. Began the day with a debriefing. "Today will be your final test," she announced calmly, voice measured and commanding. "All lessons you've learned this week, discipline, awareness, precision, teamwork, and control, will be applied in a comprehensive scenario. This is not about punishment or intimidation. It is about demonstrating mastery and internalizing the lessons so that they remain with you long after this training cycle ends. The soldiers exchanged glances, some tense, some excited. None of them doubted her capabilities anymore. The stories of the locker room confrontation, the demonstrations of skill, and the week-long training had etched authority into every mind present. Even the three men who had initially challenged her now stood, moved deliberately, and spoke only when necessary, their respect fully realized. The scenario began. A simulated multi-threat engagement across varied terrain with unpredictable variables. Soldiers had to navigate, respond to hostile elements, coordinate communication, execute tactical maneuvers, and rescue hostages under extreme time constraints. The complexity of the exercise tested every skill had taught, from observation and anticipation to decision-making under stress. Moved among the soldiers, offering subtle guidance without directly interfering. Her presence alone was enough to focus the teams. Soldiers anticipated each other's movements, maintained awareness of the environment, and executed precise actions in a way that even seasoned trainers would have found impressive. Mistakes were rare, and when they occurred, they were corrected immediately with calm authority, emphasizing reasoning over reprimand. The three men from the locker room performed admirably, no longer the brash, careless soldiers they had once been. The tall one managed the strategic points with calm confidence, providing leadership to his peers without arrogance. The sneaky whisperer anticipated movements, coordinating silent communications flawlessly. The smallest, once cocky private moved with precise timing, supporting his squad with observation and tact. Each had internalized lessons and now applied them seamlessly under pressure. As the scenario reached its climax, a critical moment occurred. The simulated hostage was placed in a highly vulnerable position, requiring split-second decision-making. Soldiers had to coordinate silently, navigate obstacles, and neutralize multiple threats simultaneously. The tension was palpable, observed without intervention, letting the soldiers rely on the skills she had instilled. With perfect coordination, the team executed the maneuver flawlessly. Every soldier was in position, communication was seamless, and the simulated hostage was rescued without error. The completion of the exercise marked not only a physical victory but a symbolic one, the transformation of a base that had once doubted, dismissed, and challenged her authority into a cohesive, disciplined unit capable of executing complex tasks under pressure. Gathered the soldiers for a final debriefing. Her tone remained calm, yet carried unmistakable weight. You have demonstrated not only skill but understanding. You have internalized discipline, teamwork, and awareness. You have learned that arrogance and underestimation lead to failure, while focus, preparation, and respect lead to success. Carry these lessons with you always, not just here but wherever duty calls. The soldiers stood quietly, absorbing her words. There was no need for applause or accolades. The respect in their eyes, the subtle nods, and the sense of pride reflected in their posture spoke volumes. They had been transformed, and they knew it. Even the base commander acknowledged the impact, stepping forward. "Ward," he said solemnly, "you have done more than train soldiers. You have reshaped Fort. Your legacy here will last far beyond this week." Allowed herself a rare, subtle smile. She had achieved what she intended, not just skillful soldiers, but disciplined, self-aware individuals capable of acting under pressure, thinking critically, and respecting authority. The lessons she had imparted would ripple through the base for months, influencing every drill, every engagement, and every decision made by these men and women. The three men from the locker room approached her afterward. They no longer carried resentment or arrogance. Instead, their expressions conveyed humility, gratitude, and recognition. The tall one spoke first. "Ma'am, we were wrong about everything. You've shown us what skill, discipline, and respect really mean." The sneaky whisperer added, "It's not just about fighting, it's about thinking, observing, and controlling yourself. We understand that now." The smallest private, usually quick with a sarcastic remark, simply nodded, silent but sincere. Regarded them with calm authority. The lesson is not just for you three, it is for all of you. Strength without control, confidence without skill, and bravery without awareness are meaningless. Carry these lessons, live by them, and teach them to others when the opportunity arises. Her words were precise, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Throughout the rest of the day, soldiers reflected on their progress. Teams discussed strategy, exchanged observations, and reviewed their movements with renewed focus. The culture of the base had shifted permanently. Arrogance had been replaced with humility. Casual disregard had been replaced with attentiveness. Mockery had been replaced with mutual respect. Ward had not only trained the soldiers but transformed the environment itself. In the quiet moments, walked among the soldiers, observing, listening, and providing guidance when necessary. She did not seek recognition. Her satisfaction came from the visible growth, the tangible change in mindset, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the lessons she had imparted had taken root. The base was now a living embodiment of the discipline, skill, and focus she valued. As the sun set over Fort, paused to take in the scene. Soldiers moved with purpose, coordinated seamlessly, and carried themselves with a newfound sense of pride and responsibility. Even the three men from the locker room incident, once brash and disrespectful, had become models of discipline and skill. The week-long transformation was complete. Knew that challenges would continue, that crises and tests would arise, but the foundation had been laid. Fort was no longer a base defined by arrogance, disorder, or casual disregard. It was a base shaped by respect, discipline, and excellence. Her presence, authority, and training had left an indelible mark. Before leaving for the evening, addressed the soldiers one final time. Remember this week, not as an exercise, but as a standard. Carry it forward in every action, every decision, and every challenge. Respect, discipline, awareness, and skill are not optional, they are essential. Live by them, teach them, and never underestimate anyone again. The soldiers, standing tall and attentive, absorbed every word. They had witnessed the depth of her skill, felt the weight of her authority, and internalized her lessons. Fort would remember Ward, not just for the dramatic locker room confrontation, but for the transformation she had created, a legacy of discipline, respect, and excellence that would endure long after she left. Turned, walking toward the horizon, her presence calm, measured, and commanding. She had arrived as a quiet, unassuming civilian advisor, yet she was leaving as a force that had reshaped an entire base. Her lessons would ripple through time, influencing every soldier who had trained under her, every decision made under pressure, and every operation conducted with skill and discipline. Fort had been tested, challenged, and transformed, and in the center of it all stood Ward, silent, disciplined, and unstoppable, the embodiment of respect, authority, and mastery.